Well, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the virtual world this evening. We've got a really wonderful program for everyone. My name is Denise Keel. I'm the Executive Director at the Michigan Climate Action Network. So we are here tonight, everyone, because if you've been living under a rock, you might not have noticed, but otherwise, we are being besieged. There are at least 16 new projects of hyperscale AI data center developments being proposed here in Michigan right now. And the public response has engaged folks from all backgrounds and all walks of life. And I think tonight that far-ranging interest is also shown in the co-hosts. We're here tonight with the League of Women Voters to educate our populations and our constituents on just what is going on, because we get so many questions. And as these developments arrive in our communities, we've lined up some fantastic speakers that are going to explore a variety of issues. Lee Shaver from Union Concerned Scientists is going to talk a little bit about the impacts of rising demand on achieving our clean energy goals. We have a wonderful retired technology executive, Prescott Balch, going to talk about the technological and economic claims that we often hear as data centers come to our communities. We're really lucky to have a great partnership with Vote Solar, a regional look to be able to think about other states. It's not just Michigan that is experiencing this, and Boratha is going to give us that bird's eye view of the region and what's going on. And then we'll close things out with Chris Gilmer-Hill from Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, who will talk about some of the policies and regulations that we maybe should be considering here in Michigan. That's a lot of topics and issues to cover in just an hour and a half. And I will note, of course, we cannot cover everything tonight. There are plenty of other issues around water, around other just land use conflicts. And so I invite all of you to join us in my community. It is a safe and trusted space, which means you do have to register for it. But that's so we can make sure we know who is in that space and talking to each other. And there's an entire course there on data centers that has a lot more information of those topics and different pieces. And that's a space where you too can share the information that you're learning, the local on the ground pieces that are happening, or find other folks to talk to about your community needs. So we invite you all to come in there and keep having this conversation even after tonight. And with us also, my pleasure to introduce our co-host for the evening, who would also like to welcome you tonight. Sandy Serena Elser is the Vice President of Advocacy with the League of Women Voters. Sandy, help us set the stage a little bit more tonight.
Yes, and welcome everybody, especially welcome to everybody who's here and to the MyCan group for helping to organize this presentation and to our wonderful panelists who are going to do a great job of introducing this subject. I'm just here to tell you that the League of Women Voters of Michigan is a nonpartisan political organization. We work to increase the public's understanding of major public policy issues, and this includes understanding the effects that data centers may have on our environment, our energy rates, and Michigan's clean and renewable energy goals. So thanks to all of you for being here to help explore this new phenomenon of data centers. And now I'll turn it back to Denise to introduce our first panelist.
Great. Thanks so much for this partnership, Sandy. It's been a lot of fun, and we do a lot of great work with League of Women Voters. More to come on all of that. So it's my pleasure to kick this off. And first up, a former energy consultant and electrical engineer, Lee Shaver studies the effectiveness, scalability, and impact of technologies that support a fast and equitable transition to a fully decarbonized grid. As a senior energy analyst with the Union of Concerned Scientists, Lee will give an overview of their recent report. We're going to drop this in the chat because it's fantastic, and you're going to get the big overview tonight of the impacts of data centers to energy use and specifically to how we meet our clean energy goals and climate goals in places like Michigan, where we're lucky enough to have them. Lee, it's so wonderful to be working with you. Please take it away and tell us what you've learned and about your report.
All right, thanks so much, Denise. And give me just a second to get my screen share going. Oops. All right, and can someone give me a thumbs up that you're seeing a presentation and hearing me okay?
Looks
All
great.
right, great. Thank you so much. Sorry, hold on. Get to my presenter view. Okay, there we go. So yeah, thanks again for the opportunity to present. Really appreciate everybody being here this evening. I'm really excited about all the other speakers that are here too. I'm looking forward to learning quite a bit myself. So I'll dive right in. For those of you who are not familiar with the Union of Concerned Scientists, we are a national nonprofit organization founded more than 50 years ago. Actually, it's 57 years ago yesterday, I believe. Um, Founded by scientists and students at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And our mission is to put rigorous, independent science into action, developing solutions and advocating for a healthy, safe, and just future. Today, we're a group of nearly 250 scientists, analysts, policy experts, organizers, and communicators dedicated to that purpose. And we have over 8,000 supporters in the state of Michigan. So hopefully, some of you are on the line today. Appreciate you joining the call. So I'm going to give a project overview of the analysis that we did. We modeled how the U.S. can meet electricity demand from data centers across demand and policy scenarios. We evaluated the impacts of the impacts on wholesale electric costs, emissions, public health, and climate damage. And the results from this study include a national report, technical appendix, and then state-specific fact sheets for Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. I was the lead on the Michigan fact sheet, and those are the results that I'm going to be highlighting here tonight. So what we find is that under current policies in Michigan, data center load growth will account for up to 57% of electricity demand growth by 2030, turning down a little bit to 38% by 2050 as other sectors like building and transportation electrification increase. From 2026 to 2050, data centers increase total electricity system costs by $18 billion to $51 billion, or 10 to 23%. And that's at the wholesale level. Some of the other speakers, I believe, are going to touch on how do those costs translate into our individual bills. It's important to note that increases in total electric system costs do not have to result in increased bills for everyone in the state. There are policy and regulatory pathways to protect people from having their bills increase as a result of data centers. So that's something important to highlight. I won't be touching on that, but some of the other speakers will. Next, data centers increase export of electric energy from in-state fossil plants to neighboring states. This is important, as I'll highlight later, because Michigan's clean energy laws only cover generation that is sold within the state. The laws do not apply to energy that is generated in Michigan and exported to other states. And finally, data centers lead to increased pollution and emissions, increasing health costs by up to $4.1 billion locally and climate damages by $213 billion globally. So for this briefing, I'm going to be focusing on why this electricity demand growth presents an urgent need for policy to protect communities and secure a healthy, reliable, and affordable future for Michiganders. So let's look at the specific demand projections from data centers. So in 2025, total energy usage across the state was approximately 100,000 gigawatt hours. And at the time, there were approximately 200 megawatts of data centers, which used about 1,200 gigawatt hours. So just over 1% of the energy in the state was used by data centers in 2025. And let me pause here for a minute to kind of explain the relationship between gigawatts and gigawatt hours, because I'm going to touch on that a little bit. So the easiest way to think of this is a gigawatt or a megawatt is the rate at which a data center is using energy. And then the gigawatt hours or megawatt hours is the total amount of energy that is used. So for example, the 200 megawatts of data centers meant that they were using energy at a rate of 200 megawatts. If they used energy for an hour, they would have consumed 200 megawatt hours of energy. And then across the year, there's about 9,000 hours, 8,760. One thing about data centers is they use energy almost constantly. So when you multiply that 200 megawatts times 8,760 hours times a 70% 70% of the time that they're using energy. That's how you get to that 1,200 gigawatt hours figure. Now, by 2050, we expect that data centers could use nearly 20% of Michigan's energy. So in 2050, 20% of all the energy used in the state would be going to power data centers. At the time, that would be more than either the industrial or the transportation sectors. So that's a lot of energy. In terms of the specific amounts of data centers that we're projecting, underneath this mid-growth scenario, that's sort of our central set of assumptions about how much data center growth there is in the state. We reach a figure of about 2.2 gigawatts. Now, we ran this modeling, we conducted this analysis before the 1.4 gigawatt data center in Saline Township in DTE territory was approved. If that had been approved when we did our initial analysis, we likely would have increased these projections. So I'm going to be focusing on that central projection, that figure of 2.2 gigawatt. But in the report, you can see what the numbers would be for that higher level, that 5 gigawatts of data centers in the state, which at this point in time, with what we know now, is likely the more accurate figure. All right, so how do data centers change Michigan capacity? Again, this is focusing on the gigawatt numbers. This is, how big are the power plants that are built in the state to supply these data centers? If we look at a current policy scenario, so continuing with all the policies that we have right now, we can expect that data center electricity demand will be met mostly with fossil gas. So 2 gigawatts more worth of fossil gas plants would be needed to meet those data centers. And the sudden presence of data centers and the nature of their electricity demand means that the state would opt to build more gas in place of clean resources like wind compared to a scenario where there's no data center. But in contrast, stronger clean energy policies, so the CO2 reduction policy that we modeled, would reduce reliance on gas and result in the construction of more renewables, increasing the state's resilience and flexibility to future changes as well. And we would actually see a reduction of about 1.6 gigawatts worth of gas. Now looking at the generation mix. So again, this is the amount of energy that's produced. The last slide was showing the size of the plants that are built to meet the demand. And this slide is showing the amount of energy that is produced to actually run those data centers. So again, under current policies, what we see is that the total amount of gas generation increases dramatically, whereas under the CO2 reduction policy, the plot on the right there, total gas generation actually decreases by 82%. And of this energy, 75% of it is actually coming from plants that would have what's called carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS. Now, this is a technology that's not yet been proven. However, our analysis is assuming that by 2050, the technology would be reasonably developed that we could assume that for existing gas plants, CCS might be an option. Now, under all other scenarios, so under the current policy scenario or a scenario that restores some of the IRA tax credits, what we see is that gas generation increases and there would not be any plants with CCS, with carbon capture and storage. Now, looking at the exports, I mentioned this earlier on. Currently, so in 2026, we see that Michigan exports very little energy to any of its neighbors. It's around 1,000 gigawatt hours, which is about 1% of the state's total generation is being exported to neighboring states. But what we see is that the exports grow 50-fold under current policies with the growth in demand from data centers, whereas under CO2 reduction policy, which again is our suite of proposed clean energy policies, the increase is only about 20-fold. And this is very important because, as I mentioned, the current clean energy laws only apply to retail sales, not overall generation. So utilities and power plants in the state under current laws can continue to burn fossil gas and export that energy to other states. And the impact of this, as folks are likely aware, is that as you burn fossil gas, there's going to be more CO2 emissions. That's what the plot is showing here. The 3 pink lines are under current policies, different levels of demand that we see. And what we see is essentially from 2035 through to 2050, CO2 emissions in the state under current policies will increase. The CO2 reduction policy that we modeled covers all emissions from the power sector, not just those tied to retail sales. So that CO2 reduction policy would apply to any generation within the state, whether it's used in the state or exported to other states. And it's also important to note that while there are policies that have been proposed and analyzed using this concept of bring your own new clean energy, where data centers, in order to come online, would need to supply their own clean energy. What we're seeing is that alone would not be enough to reduce CO2 emissions in the long term in Michigan. So while that is certainly a policy that has its merits, it would need to be part of other stronger policies as well if the goal was for Michigan to reach net zero emissions. And this table on the bottom left here is showing that the first two rows are the existing requirements, the renewable energy credit portfolio, where utilities have to reach 60% renewables by 2035, and the existing clean energy portfolio, where they have to reach 100% clean energy sources by 2040. Again, both of those two only apply to sales within the state. And then that bottom row is what the policy, the CO2 reduction policy that we included in our model. And I'll wrap up here with some major takeaways. The biggest thing to keep in mind, the biggest thing to remember here is that Michigan can both meet increased demand from data centers and continue phasing out fossil fuels without raising rates with the right policies in place. And if that's the goal, there are policies, there is regulation that can accomplish that goal. What we see in the analysis is that load growth in Michigan increases export of electric energy from in-state fossil plants to neighboring states. And despite the existing clean energy laws, emissions and pollution continue to increase. Policy makers and regulators have tools, they have options that could allow them to ensure data center costs are not passed on to others. Those policies and regulations are not in place currently. And finally, the climate and health benefits of reducing fossil fuel use outweigh the costs of the clean energy transition. So I'll wrap up there. The link to our full report is here on the screen, and I believe that is in the chat too. So I look forward to hearing from the other speakers and answering any questions that come up. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lee, and for Union of Concerned Scientists for all this tremendous work that you have done. What a wonderful contribution to this piece. So up next, we're going to have a little bit of a break from me in this program. And I want to introduce you again to Amanda Robert, is our network manager. She's an exceptional organizer with us and also has firsthand experience of data centers coming to town as a resident. And she's going to take just a minute or two to talk about what that feels like as she introduces our next speaker. So Amanda, I'm going to try to spotlight you. You want to take it away here?
Yeah, thanks so much, Denise. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And so, like many others who are lucky enough to work in climate or environmental policy, I've long been aware of the potential impacts of hyperscale data centers on our communities and on our climate goals. But it felt very different right before the holidays last year when I learned that a almost 2 million square foot data center campus had already been approved under 3 miles from my own home. It had been approved with only the approval of an appointed planning commission, and suddenly it was no longer just a policy question or a headline. It felt immediate, and it felt really scary. So I got involved in my local community, long been an organizer, and what's really been inspiring is the organizing that's happening right here in all of our neighborhoods around the different proposals that we've seen. Local residents have been coming together and sharing information, asking questions, creating space for dialogue. And that effort led me to help organize a couple different educational panels, both in Howell and right near my home in South Lyon. And that work led me to meet our next speaker, Prescott Balch, who has become a tremendous resource for communities navigating these proposals. Prescott is a retired technology executive in the financial services industry. He has been adamant that we need data centers just as much as he is that we really need to find the right place for them. Since he successfully resisted a hyperscale data center in his own community, he has really gotten involved in helping small communities across the country, especially here in the Midwest and Great Lakes region, understand the technology and financial risks that are associated with these big proposals. He's actually come and traveled here to Michigan twice already to do in-person panels and really talk to communities to help them understand the proposal right in front of them. And we thank him so much for the work that he's been doing and the knowledge that he's been sharing. So, Prescott, please take it away.
All right, thank you. Let me share my screen and we shall get started. So the smaller print here is probably the most important. Don't trust anyone who claims that data centers are all risk or only risk or only reward. Uh, as you can see from maybe this next slide, um, there are rewards that you can't deny, and I will call them out as much as anybody. There is an eye-watering amount of tax revenue. The smaller the community, the more eye-watering it is because as a percentage of the community's tax revenue, it's going to be massive. And a, a lot of people that I've run into just don't really understand the scale of these buildings. It's hard it's hard to have a mind's eye around 2 million square feet or 3 million square feet, but those are massive and they generate massive tax bills. And uh, so, yes, it's a foregone conclusion that if the buildings get built, you're going to have a lot of tax revenue. And that's largely what people are chasing when they're chasing these projects. It's also a given that you will have an abundant amount of construction jobs. And those construction jobs are good, high-paying jobs. We want those people to have good, high-paying jobs and lots of them. And this kind of construction keeps them busy for years. And also, impossible to deny, that abundant construction work generates its own indirect economic benefit. Those people live someplace and they eat someplace and they grocery shop someplace. And especially in a small community, you've added, say, 1,500, even 2,000 people doing the construction work, and that's going to have some amount of indirect economic benefit. But then we turn to some of the risks. Risk number one is the smaller you are, the more you have what the financial industry calls financial concentration risk. You have over-reliance on a single industry and a single taxpayer. And as the state of Michigan knows all too well, that doesn't always end well. These two graphs are two communities in Wisconsin that have active data center projects and financial concentration risk that they're willingly walking into. The blue is the size of the valuation of the data center buildings, and the red is the size of everything else in the town. And the technology industry also we should note that it's very volatile. It reinvents itself regularly. You all know this at least implicitly because you're not carrying around any technology that's 50 years old. You don't still have the first mobile phone ever built in your pocket because they don't fit in your pocket. You don't still have a Radio Shack TRS-80 Model 1 that was put out on the market in 1975 or so. The technology industry is constantly reinventing itself. It's constantly casting aside yesterday's old technology and chasing the new cool thing. Secondly, there is a lot of people who believe artificial intelligence is in a bubble. If you're old enough to remember the dot-com bubble, same thing happened. We had a technology trigger. This internet thing is cool. We should put it everywhere. And the industry being what it is, we ride this line up to the peak of inflated expectations. And then everybody realizes, oh, geez, we overbuilt. We got a little overzealous. Let's pull back. A lot of venture capital gets pulled out because people aren't making money. And then we crash down to the trough of disillusionment. And then we realize, yeah, that technology really is kind of cool. And it really was intended all along to become part of the fabric of society. And we find the steady state. The same thing is going to happen to artificial intelligence. However, we're on the path up from the trigger to the peak. I can't tell you where we are. I can't tell you how long it's going to last or how high it's going to go or how hard it will crash. But I can tell you that it will match that pattern because every major change in technology has met that pattern. The quote that I choose to include here is from Mark Zuckerberg, and it's rather telling because it helps get you in the mind of the tech execs, and it also helps explain why there's so many of these, not just in your state, but across the country. And I'll read it. If we end up misspending a couple $100 billion, that would be really nice to be able to say, wouldn't it? I think that it's going to be very unfortunate. But what I'd say is actually, I think the risk is higher on the other side. I found this an extremely telling quote because what he's saying is the hype that we're on with that peak to the peak of inflated expectations, it's so important that they race up that with everyone else that they they have to potentially waste a couple $100 billion getting there. Because if they don't, and their competitors beat them there, they lose market share. Their companies are half the value that they should have been. And it's a really bad thing. So their 100 billion, $200 billion is worth the gamble. And that explains the bottom graph, which is a two-scale drawing of current size of data center market and currently proposed aggregate size. And industries just don't grow that fast, ever. That is a massive amount of new data center demand, and it's why there are 16, 17 proposals in Michigan. There's another risk on the horizon, and that's obsolescence. Uh, as I said, technology industry relentlessly innovates. There's no data on how long a hyperscale data center will last because they're too new. Historically, data centers have lasted 15 to 25 before somebody says, hey, you should probably use this as something else, retrofit it into a office building or some such. But the problem with hyperscale data centers is they're purpose built. They have very limited reuse possibilities. And Saline Township is my favorite example here of a community that realized this problem going in and put in the contract a clause that said, you developer are going to buy a bond. And if this thing is empty for 5 consecutive years, we're going to use that bond to tear it down. It's a very creative solution to that problem. And I wish more communities were doing that to protect themselves against this risk. There's also legal and financial risk. Not a surprise. Small communities are no match for Fortune 50 companies. You will make bad deals before, during, and after. You will have one large taxpayer that can do anything you want. Just as a data point there, the city of Port Washington, after signing a deal with Vantage, the very first thing Vantage did was march into City Hall and say, by the way, we want 24/7 construction. And the village, now as committed to the project plan as the developer, said, okay, just try not to make too much noise. Honest to God, they said that out loud. But and turn off the lights you're not using. They said that as well. But also, once they become taxpayer versus suitor, they're going to challenge valuations every year. That can cause big swings. And if you remember the financial concentration slide, if you have a big swing in something that's 50% of your tax revenue, that can be a big problem for your tax revenue. And the only way to make up any big swing is on the backs of existing taxpayers. So that concentration risk plus the fluctuation in valuation can become a significant financial problem for a small town. There are also some significant benefit myths. One, direct jobs. The tech companies, I'm not sure where they're getting their math during the sales cycle, but I went to the actual data in Northern Virginia, 549 data centers, 10,000 and change employees. It works out to about 18 per building. I figure that's the most relevant statistic. It's statistically significant, and that's the one I'm going with because it's the actuals. So if anybody's saying it's 100 or 200 employees in a building, they're just not telling the truth. There's also not very much indirect economic benefit, largely because data centers don't have a lot of people, and it's always people that generate that indirect economic benefit. Then the other thing I like to offer here is this benign neighbor notion. So there's a lot of talk about the noise and so on and so forth from the place. Uh, this map here is an interesting case study. It's West Des Moines, Iowa, and it's 15 years after the data centers were built. West Des Moines, Iowa is growing quite nicely. There's got a lot of other business in town with people. And if you'll notice from the map, there's not a whole lot. There's in fact nothing near that data center campus. And I don't know why. They maybe drove up the land price. Maybe there's construction nuisance everybody's staying away from. Maybe there's a cooling system is noisy. But this is not a single data point. It's not a single use case. This happens in multiple places. I have maps from several communities that all look the same. Nobody wants to live next to a data center. The only place you find homes near a data center is where the data center is built near the homes. Which brings me to construction, because this has morphed into maybe even my number one issue. And that is communities are used to zoning that generally focuses on the permanent use of the property. What is the noise level long term? What is the traffic pattern? What setbacks do we need? What's the lighting, et cetera? And we know that construction is always a bigger nuisance than permanent use, but we tolerate it because it isn't that long. And the delta between the construction nuisance and permanent isn't that large. But data centers are different. They are the most heavy industrial scale construction activity you've ever seen, and maybe more. And their permanent use is light, very light industrial. And the question that I pose to communities is, at what duration does the construction schedule become a factor in the zoning? You would never put a petroleum refinery near a school. At least I hope not. So why would you put a heavy industrial 7-year long construction project next to houses or schools or hospitals or shopping or anything? It's a very interesting question that really tosses on its ear the standard approach to zoning, which always focuses on that permanent use. And this is a topic everybody's missing. I would encourage everybody to Google Port Washington, Wisconsin data center construction and read some of the current stories about resident impact in the 1 mile radius of the construction site. It's not pretty. And then lastly here, tax breaks. Please don't do these. Sorry if you're in the data center development world, but we used to have a handshake agreement that if we gave people tax breaks, that the taxpayers got something in return. They got some economic activity that offset the tax revenue that was abated, and it paid for that abatement, and the community was better off. But for some reason in the data center conversation, we've sort of lost that, and we're giving tax breaks to something that doesn't generate jobs, doesn't generate economic activity. It's just a big land use, and it should be treated that way in the context of tax breaks, in my opinion. And then to stay true to my initial or what was presented by Amanda, I believe we need data centers. I used them for a living. It was a very healthy living that I'm really proud of, and I couldn't have done it without data centers. I believe these things belong in a place first and foremost that can absorb the large fluctuations in valuation, up to and including valuation drop to zero. And so if a data center is going to be under 10%, it starts to become tolerable. That's still trouble if it goes to zero. Preferably, it should be less than 5% of the total valuation of all the properties in the community. And the alternative here that isn't number one, but can be a community that wants them, is somebody that wants to build a lot of them. That one of the snarky comments that I like to make is data centers can attract one thing and one thing only, and that's more data centers. Like Dallas, Texas, like Northern Virginia, the communities get into the first one, and if they don't have a really bad experience, then it becomes okay to build another and another and another, and then they get sort of hooked on the construction benefit, and next thing you know, they have 15. It can be the right choice for a community if they have a problem. Maybe they have some economic desperation of the one big employer just left town. And and maybe they just like the construction work and they want to keep that going. So those are when somebody asks me that tough question, that's how I answer it. I think those are the places where these make the most sense. At the end of the day, it's those risks that have to be weighed against the rewards, and the rewards are again the eye-watering tax revenue. And every community, I believe, needs the information first and foremost. Every community is going to have a different analysis that they place against that information. But I just don't want small communities not realizing that there's more to it than the number on a piece of paper that reflects the projected tax revenue. There's a lot more to the story, and I'm trying to help educate everybody on what those downsides are. So that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Prescott, for coming and sharing your expertise, your background. We knew we needed to hear from someone exactly like you with that technology background and finance and executive piece. I really appreciate you joining us
My
here
my
tonight.
pleasure. Yeah, my pleasure.
Well, we're going to keep this show going. I see some amazing questions in the chat. Folks, keep on putting those questions in there for us, and we're going to keep going along here. Next up, another former engineer, this time in a mechanical specialty, started out in batteries and electric vehicles before he also turned to guiding regulatory policies around generation. Now a senior regulatory manager for the Midwest with Vote Solar, Boratha has a perspective to share again that's a little bit wider than our township site fights and even our state. As the regional director, he gets to see what other states are doing. And this isn't just happening in Michigan. And we have a lot to learn from how other folks have been responding and what they're trying to do. So, Boratha, please give us your perspective and share what's going on in some of our neighbors.
Thank you so much, Denise. If anyone is curious as to what automotive company Denise has been hinting at, it's Ford Motor Company. I unfortunately do not do any warranty recalls, so please don't email me if your car breaks down, especially if it's a Ford Pinto. So, like everyone else, I will share my screen here and go into presentation mode. I also, just as, a side note, I have a timer here, so I'm just gonna time myself just in case I go over. So once again, thank you everyone for coming to this webinar panel to hear everything about data centers. As Denise mentioned, I work at Volt Solar. And just very quickly, we are not as old as the Union of Concerned Scientists. We are only about 20 odd years old. We fight for a 100% clean energy transition that puts the interests, health, and well-being of people at its center. We originally started out at California. I'm not a native Californian, so we could all make fun of California. Originally trying to promote solar legislation in the state of California, and it soon grew out to focus on the national scale, working in various states throughout the country. And then our executive director realized, oh, wait a minute, how can we promote solar on people's roofs when the roofs need repair, people can't afford it, and utilities are in the way, preventing people from installing and connecting their solar to the grid. So we've since transitioned our mission from just fighting for solar to making sure that the people are at the center as we're transitioning to a 100% clean energy future. So, I will give an overview of some of our Midwest neighbors. Not all of them, just a few of them, just to help people understand how data centers are showing up in these states and how these states are addressing or not addressing all of these data centers coming online. First, some of you may know our neighbors to the south, Indiana. Amazon recently constructed and opened their largest data center in the state of Indiana. It is about 1,200 acres of land. I saw that there were a couple of questions earlier about how much land does a data center have. And at least for this Amazon data center, I approximate it to be a little bit more than 50% of Mackinac Island. So just giving a reference for us Michiganders here. The estimated cost of this data center is $11 billion. And as Lee provided information for us earlier, in terms of the amount of energy, it is slated to use 2.2 gigawatts of electricity, with rough estimates for Indiana homes at least to be about 1.6 million homes. I'm sure Prescott could give some more information, some better examples of community benefits agreements of various data centers. For this specific data center, I put community benefits in quotations because the community benefits that Amazon promised, they made this agreement with the state of Indiana, essentially the governor of Indiana, and the electric utility providing the electric service for them. So most of these benefits are regarding workforce training for Indiana residents to learn about data centers, basic electrician uh, careers. So all of these workforce development opportunities are specifically so that they can train future workers in the data center field. Some other things to think about Indiana as a state as a whole. There were proposed bills at the end of 2025 to fast track data center approvals. Um, they did leave in air and water permits regarding all of those introduced bills. There are also some other bills that would strip those water and air permits to make the fast track even faster. There were some proposed state bills in Indiana to study the impacts of data centers, and I underscored study. That's it. That's all the bills do. Study, but then there's nothing that comes after it. One of the bigger utilities in the state of Indiana, Duke Energy Indiana, and I do love their acronym DEI, they are looking to sell a portion of their coal plants to third parties. And I wanted to note that specifically because if I was, say, for example, Amazon, and I wanted to build an even bigger data center, I could potentially create an offshoot company to purchase that coal plant, build a data center next to that coal plant, and operate that coal plant in perpetuity, with the only concerns being certain EPA air quality reports that I would be responsible for. But, I'm sure everyone loves the current EPA that we have. And of course, all Indiana coal plants are expected to be forced to remain online via federal executive orders. Next up, Minnesota, our neighbors to the northwest. Um, they actually had and passed a data center bill in 2025. It did create large data center fees for them to apply for land and actually start construction. But on the flip side, it does extend data center tax credits for another 35 years. And there are some very soft protections around water, specifically around researching water and making agreements with water utilities instead of community members. And some of you might have heard there's a huge data center that Google will be building in southern Minnesota. There's some estimates that it's going to be $4 billion. Google and the utility have not released the actual cost of this data center, so I just put it in quotes just because it's not confirmed yet. Google and the utility, however, have promised that that Google will pay for 1,900 megawatts or 1.9 gigawatts of clean energy that they will be paying for to put onto the grid. And Google promises to pay for energy efficiency funding. Just for some folks online, energy efficiency, think of the discounts that you would get for purchasing LED light bulbs or purchasing energy efficient stoves, even potentially certain upgrades that you could do in your home so that you could use less energy. So again, Google promises to pay for the funding around the energy efficiency uh, projects that residents might be able to do. And then finally, I don't like to talk about our neighbors to the west that much, but we have Illinois, the Chicago Bears, who might be the Gary, Indiana Bears. They have a proposed legislation this year in their legislature called the Power Act. And POWER is an acronym that stands for Protecting Our Water, Energy, and Ratepayers. I find this proposed legislation to be very fascinating because it has clear language that would prevent cost shift from data centers to consumers. Lee mentioned an acronym called Beyonce, Bring Your Own New Clean Energy. There are clear languages around forcing data centers to pay for new clean and renewable energy. There are clear requirements for data centers to have binding community benefit agreements. And there are a lot of additional consumer protections, such as funding all of the ratepayer related projects that the utilities need to help, low-income residents with their energy efficiency projects and things like that. So, what I find fascinating about this bill is that all of these clear things are lined up in this bill, clear language, essentially saying that data centers need to pay up if they want to build in the state of Illinois. Some fun facts about the state of Illinois. Uh, Data centers alone increased Chicago's residents' monthly bills by $70 last year in the summer. The Chicago area utility, Commonwealth Edison, expects 29 terawatt hours of data centers to come online by 24. Lee could give you another comparison of how big that is. The easy comparison I have that all of the Chicago area residents only use 20 terawatt hours. So if all of these data centers do come true and are built by 2040, they're using more energy than all of the residents in the city of Chicago. So coming back to Michigan, I'm not going to talk too much about Michigan. Chris will be able to help us wade through the waters here a little bit more. But just a quick highlight that everyone knows and love, the OpenAI or the ChatGPT Saline Township Data Center. Some fun facts, which I'm sure all of you already know. It's a $7 billion project, 1.4 gigawatts of power that it needs, which is a quarter of DTE's current total energy. It's estimated that they will need 250 acres to build this data center, which is more than 10% of Mackinac Island, with Mackinac Island being about 2,200 acres. The estimated water use that I've seen some nonprofits are estimating is that it will use 5 million gallons of water per day. I tried to find a comparison. The best comparison I found was that Grand Rapids actually treats about 40 million gallons of water a day. So if you look at 5 million gallons, that's more than 10% of all of Grand Rapids, which is something for us to think about. So with all of this in mind, what what do we have to consider when we want to talk to our legislators or be more involved in MyCan or organize around data centers and needing them to be responsible? So, a reminder that state and local officials do have power. Some people in the chat have already asked questions about the tax break bills that passed a couple of years ago. So state officials, they have to pass strict environmental siting and energy requirements for data centers. And let's not forget about our local municipalities. Some municipalities did vote to deny data centers and issue moratoriums, but also some other local municipalities throughout the state of Michigan have signed non-disclosure agreements or NDAs and passed data center permits and then immediately stayed quiet about it. So something for us to remind ourselves of is that these state and local officials do have power, but they have to be voted in. Some of you have been following the Michigan Public Service Commission, especially with the Saline Township data center. They have shown us that they do have limited power. They approved the special contract with DTE Energy, but they also require DTE Energy to work on all of these other applications. And we can go through that in the Q&A. Lee and we are involved in those cases as well, so we can give some more information there. And finally, as mentioned in the Illinois proposed bill, we need enforceable community benefit agreements, not just agreements where the data center companies do a handshake with the utilities, but community benefit agreements that center the community, that center the residents. and making sure that they have a say and are able to um, influence and dictate what the community benefit agreements say. So I think I actually went a few minutes over. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I will pass it back.
That was fantastic. So wonderful to have that perspective. Again, this is happening everywhere, and so we do need to think about, from an environmental justice perspective, where these are going, and what we are doing in Michigan is going to impact other states, and what other states are doing are impacting our grid and what's happening. So really important for us to think about this in a little bit larger perspective. Thanks so much, Boratha. And we're doing great. Speakers are doing fantastic on time. I appreciate y'all making this happen. Last but not least, and you guessed it, folks, another former, I hear there's no such thing according to Lee in the chat, but this time a software engineer. Chris Gilmer-Hall turned organizing as well, focusing on legislative committees for environmental and economic justice with numerous groups in Michigan. And he joins us today in his role as the policy associate with the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. And Chris is going to share some updates on the lay of the legislative land here in Michigan. There is a lot going on, folks. So good luck, Chris, and hopefully Boratha set you up there pretty well. Just what kinds of policies, regulations, and community benefits should Michigan actually be considering? And just one other note, I cannot turn annotations off, so we really appreciate whoever is drawing, but your annotations, just so you know, everybody can see them. So maybe we should keep those to ourselves. All right, thanks, Chris. Take it away.
Yeah, for sure. And hey, y'all, afternoon. So I will essentially just be going over big picture. What are these local issues? Obviously, we're all aware. There's a reason we're all here. There's a reason so many folks we know are talking about these. Like, what are the issues people have in their communities? And then I'm going to go over what's been proposed in our state legislature that could address some of these issues, and what else could we do to sort of take on some of these various things that everybody is very concerned about. But I do want to start with just a sort of overview of what the issue is. So I'm sure everybody here is aware, but this is all really in the aftermath of a bill that passed our state house and state senate last term. We passed a state level tax exemption for sales and use taxes across the state for certain data centers that meet certain criteria. That wasn't without conditions. It does have some built-in protections. It does have some not only ratepayer protections, but also some baseline environmental standards. There's also a lot of conversation about whether those were strong enough. I'm not going to get into any specifics on, where exactly I think those should fall, but that is the context that we're sort of starting from. I do also want to flag at the start. I know a lot of the conversations that folks have to do with AI itself, and I think that's absolutely a vital conversation. What I'm really interested in, what I want to focus on, sort of if we treat AI data centers as a black box, treat it as just a thing that is consuming some amount of energy, some amount of water, and that is, in theory, generating some amount of revenue, whether tax revenue, economic, corporate revenue, et cetera. I think you'll find a lot of the problems that people have really stem from that. It's not really anything unique to AI. It's problems that stem from the way that we've set up the infrastructure to deliver power and extract revenue from these black box buildings. And so, with that in mind, what are the issues folks have? So I think number one, and the one that sort of resonates the most talking to folks, is this ratepayer impact, right? Like we've heard from several folks tonight, these data centers often have the effect, regardless of other state laws, of driving up folks' electricity rates, just increasing in demand that has tended to result in an increase in price and an increased reliance on things like methane gas, which are just objectively more expensive ways to generate electricity. So with that, one of the other big issues that you'll find, especially talking to folks that live in some of these impacted communities, folks are really concerned with the loss of some of these land uses that are being replaced. So especially things like farmland, forest, wetland. Often these data centers, the really large ones, want to come into somewhere that has a large contiguous parcel of land that's zoned conveniently for them. And generally, that's going to mean clearing out something already there, like farmland or protected natural areas. So on top of that, I know we talked a lot about the local tax and job question, and especially tax revenue, which is a real thing. There is potentially a lot of tax revenue there. And one big concern that folks have is this question of whether these promises will actually come true, whether they'll actually see the tax revenue that was promised, or whether these companies will be able to find their way through some tax exemption to get out of paying that, which is often what happens with other similar projects, at least in Michigan. So one other very common thing, air and water pollution, and especially when we're looking at something like diesel backup generators. If folks are familiar with what's happened in Memphis, Tennessee, the sort of constant use of diesel backup generators that initially were going to be for emergency use and have sort of turned into just a constant way to boost energy supply at a facility, those can have real, measurable, and pretty significant impacts on air quality. So another thing that Prescott mentioned earlier, this stranded asset risk. Like, what if this does turn out to be a bubble? What if these all go away? What if the companies all go under? You have a lot of potentially pretty small communities that now have to deal with incredibly large, incredibly expensive facilities that are now just empty, rotting husks. Another thing, sort of at a higher level, a lot of folks in Michigan just don't really like the idea of state corporate subsidies. That's whether we're talking about tax exemptions, direct cash handouts, like the subsidy that was given for the Ypsilanti Township data center. That just really doesn't sit right with folks. And kind of in a similar vein, a lot of folks are really unhappy with this question of local control and local areas being sort of bulldozed over. So I think we saw some of that in Saline, right? In Saline Township, you had a lot of local folks and a lot of local elected officials that initially had wanted to essentially say no to this and were sued under a provision of our state zoning law and forced into a settlement that, I mean, that they were able to get some concessions out of, but where they found out they essentially just did not have the power to say no to this. And lastly, also in that same vein, there's this question of transparency and democratic control. So we've heard a lot that there are often NDAs, these non-disclosure agreements that get signed that govern parts of the process. And people often don't find out about one of these projects coming into their community until it's just about too late to do anything. So with that sort of as the backdrop, the first set of bills that I want to talk about, and these are all bills that have already been introduced. These are some bills in the state Senate that mostly have to do with water. So one of the things I mentioned, this question of how do we protect ourselves from the impacts of this water consumption, potential water pollution. That's really top of mind for folks because right now we have very little in our state law in terms of requirements for disclosure of amounts that are used, disclosure of what's being added into it, what kind of conditions is the water at when it's being discharged back. Is it being discharged back at all? Often it isn't. Often when we're dealing with evaporative cooling, you're not directly discharging water back into an ecosystem. But that's something that often legally doesn't have to be disclosed based on laws right now. So this first bill that was introduced by Senator Bayer that limits consumptive water withdrawal. So any withdrawal that is above 2 million gallons per day would not be approved. It adds that new limit in our state law for state level approval of groundwater withdrawal. Now, to be clear, this is specifically consumptive withdrawals of groundwater. So this doesn't necessarily apply to municipal water hookup, which is how a lot of these data centers are getting their water. But if you had a data center coming into, say, a rural area relying on groundwater, which is the case in a lot of Michigan, even though we're so close to the Great Lakes, this would apply and this would set a hard limit on what can be withdrawn. But since that doesn't apply everywhere, there's also this other bill from Senator Schenck that at least requires that data centers report a lot more information on their water and energy usage. And this would essentially require that at the state level, a report gets prepared by state regulators containing information about how much energy, how much water all of these data centers are using. And then lastly, in line with a concern that I know a lot of folks have on the energy side, there's a proposal that would ban utilities from passing along the cost of water infrastructure upgrades. So like what happens with energy, if you're adding a massive new consumer of water, even if that's hooking up to municipal water, you're likely going to have to upgrade the system somewhat. Like if you have something that's using millions of gallons a day coming into some rural area, you're probably not set up to handle that. And this bill looks to ensure that the costs of those upgrades don't get passed on to the residential folks that were already paying for that water. So last year on the state house side, there was also a package introduced that pretty much directly tries to reverse some of what was done last year, as well as put some more safeguards around data centers. I mean, keeping in mind the issues that I talked about earlier, this is really taking on the question of state subsidies, of transparency, and the NDAs. So these first three bills, these all kind of go together. They just flat out repeal the tax exemptions that I mentioned before. So there's one for sales tax, one for use tax, and then one that has to make a wording change elsewhere in state law. So those have to be three separate bills. But that's essentially just a clean repeal. It gets rid of these sales and use tax exemptions. That would have the effect of preventing a lot of these projects. But several of the projects that are coming to Michigan have already said that they're not looking to take advantage of these sales and use tax exemptions. They're just going to pay the sales tax, which is millions of dollars, on the chips that they use because they don't want to have to comply with some of the conditions that were put in place, which I find concerning, but that's my opinion. There's also a bill that would ban NDAs, so banning these non-disclosure agreements at the local level for certain elected officials, essentially just requiring that level of transparency, requiring that if you're going to be talking to local officials about a data center proposal, that's going to be foilable, that's going to be public, that's not going to be governed by a non-disclosure agreement. And then lastly, there's this bill that's kind of separate. It wasn't directly introduced with the others, but it's a straight revocation of the data center funding that was given to specifically the University of Michigan Los Alamos data center that's proposed in Ypsilanti Township. That one was given, I believe, $100 million check, so a significant amount of state funding, in addition to federal funding, funding from elsewhere, funding from the university for this data center. And this bill just X's out that line item, revokes that funding. So finally, and this is a relatively recent addition, but just in the last couple of weeks, there was yet another package introduced. And this one is really in the direction of a moratorium. These bills, 5594 through 9596, these all sort of go together. And these are a revocation of permitting. Obviously, I have a typo. These ignore these, but the sponsors are correct. So Representative Wirtz, Wagella, and Fox have introduced a package that across three different places in state law essentially says until April of 2027, the state is not going to be approving data centers. So Eagle's not going to be issuing permits. We're not going to be issuing wetlands permits, water permits, just no new data centers until 2027. The idea being that in that time, we'll be able to figure out some other policies that can limit some of the other impacts and hopefully be better suited so that when the moratorium does wear out, we'll be able to control and have data centers come in under policies that folks find more agreeable. But that obviously leaves a lot still open, right? There's a lot of issues that those bills don't necessarily touch on. And especially when we're talking about a moratorium, intentionally, we are kind of kicking the can down the road. So some of those future directions that I see, number one, closing some clean energy loopholes. So one of the conditions that's in the sales and use tax exemption law is that the data centers are supposed to be getting 90% of their energy from clean sources. In practice, that is just not enforced. The Michigan Strategic Fund has said that if a data center is getting their energy from a utility that has a renewable energy plan, then they consider that that counts. I think legally right now that's already a very shaky argument, but it seems to me just the fact that that's even open for interpretation means that there's a lot of room to at least close that loophole and require something explicitly like the Beyonce principle that's in the Power Act that Boratha talked about. That if you're going to build a data center, you need to somehow ensure that you're powering it with clean energy, bringing that clean energy capacity, which right now doesn't exist. So the effect of that would be if you want to build a data center, we're going to expand clean energy capacity in Michigan to do that. So another thing is stronger ratepayer protections. There are proposals right now to do that just at the MPSC. The MPSC has directed our utilities to look into creating a new ratepayer class. It's called a large load class. It would functionally just be data centers. That absolutely would be a step in the right direction, along with some language in the existing law that should prevent utilities from passing those costs on to ratepayers. But we know that in practice in other states, those protections aren't always enough. And it would help to have something explicitly in state law, explicitly directing our Public Service Commission to force the utilities to pass all of those costs onto the data center companies. So we could also do a lot more to ensure local economic and tax protections. I think there's a limit to what we could do in terms of jobs because, like other folks mentioned, like Prescott mentioned, there's inherently just not that many jobs that will be at a data center in the long term. But you can lock in tax protections. I think, as he mentioned, often data centers will turn around and try to quibble over valuations or try to get tax exemptions and try to not pay chunks of that property tax, try to defer it. Ideally, these are things that we could just not approve at the local level, but we can also prevent them at the state level by banning them for data centers specifically, or by requiring written agreements that as a condition of approval, you're agreeing this is the amount, this is the valuation, you're going to pay at least this much. Just setting a floor would go a really long way to locking in what potentially are, again, really transformative tax benefits. Uh, you could also do something similar to ensure local control. So I mentioned earlier that it was a quirk of state law, or actually our exclusionary zoning provision in our state level zoning law is what allowed companies to get around the denial that happened at the local level in Saline Township. So that's something that you could pretty easily fix. That's one line in a state law. You could essentially just say this does not apply to data centers. And to be clear, this is a provision in state law that currently says if there's a land use that is otherwise legal and that has some demonstrated need, then you can't just ban that everywhere in your city. You have to have a zone for industrial, something somewhere that allows that land use. A line that just says there is no demonstrated need for data centers in any given community would get rid of that loophole. Uh, so the next thing I would point out, and this is also something that Prescott touched on earlier, stronger protections for stranded assets. Essentially, something like the demolition bonds that were included in Saline, something saying we're going to set aside some amount of the significant funds that these companies have at the outset. And if this falls apart, if this doesn't end up happening, or if the company goes under, we have this money set aside. We're going to use that to tear down this facility and restore it to some other land use that we want to see. You could also look to stronger limits on state subsidies and tax exemptions. So I think certainly the state level repeal would be a strong step in that direction. It's a pretty drastic step, but it's something that I think would go a long way to ensuring that we are getting that extra chunk of revenue. And you could also imagine a lot of other things. You could imagine just a ban on property tax exemptions, something in that direction. Transparency measures as well. I mentioned an NDA ban that's been proposed. There are often also NDAs at the state legislative level, and you could do a lot more to ban NDAs, to require more disclosure, to require a more democratic and transparent process at both the state and local level, as well as with the utilities all throughout. And then lastly, we could do a lot more to ensure land use restrictions and environmental protections. That's kind of more of an open question, but there's a lot you could do at the state level to perhaps ban data centers from replacing wetlands, from replacing certain kinds of forested lands. You could add protections for farmlands, prevent them from coming into agriculturally zoned areas. There's a lot you could do short of banning them outright. And these are all things that if we were to do a temporary moratorium, we would be able to develop and work on with local folks in local consultation to have, more state level control, more local control, and guide the development of data centers. Now, obviously, this is a pretty broad menu of policy options, but sort of my point with all this is that we do have policy options, many of which have precedence in other states. If we want to control what's happening, if we want to take care of some of these local issues that people really do care about, I think we have a lot of options to do that. But yeah, that is all I have.
Well, that was a lot. Wow, Chris, that was amazing. I shared, there are a lot of live policy and community benefit suggestions and bipartisan. So if I hope you noticed that too. This is really coming from all walks of life. So I'm gonna add back the spotlight to all of our panelists here. In the meantime, I hope that all of our participants can give a lot of love in the chat to all of these fantastic speakers that we just heard from. And good luck. I saw a lot of questions going on in the chat there, and we'll try to get all of those answered here too. Let me get you guys on the screen here a little bit. I'm getting there. I'm slow at this. This is why usually we have other team members doing this part. How'd it go? Amanda and Vicky are going to help us get together all of these questions. Let me get Vicky up here too.
Yeah. Hi. There was a lot of chatter about renewable energies. So one of the questions is, what would it look like if these data centers are required to bring their own clean energy? And do you have any examples of other states that have pushed this? How have they done it? What does it look like?
Does anybody want to go ahead and tackle that one for us?
I can piggyback off of Lee.
Sure. We
You're
want you
putting
to
me
go
in the
first, Lee.
spotlight. Yes, there are some challenges. So data centers use a lot of power in a very small space. So even if you put solar on the rooftop, it's not going to be enough to power the entire data center. So it has to be built somewhere else typically. Um, and Boratha did talk about other states that are either enforcing or pursuing bring your own clean energy requirements, which is definitely an option from a reliability perspective because the renewables are located separate from the data centers. There's still some challenges that have to be addressed there.
Yeah, and as Lee mentioned in the chat earlier regarding is just bringing new clean energy enough? Uh, the UCS report says no, especially when we look at the emissions considerations. You know, the ultimate goal is still like climate change is the long-term issue that we have to solve. Um, I do want to point back to Minnesota, specifically the Google data center example. They are doing way more in terms of bringing on or promising to pay for clean and renewable energy versus, say, the Michigan Saline data center. Not to say, you know, Google is better, but just saying at least if we're just looking at trying to bring clean energy online faster where the customers are not paying for it, Google at least is saying, we've got billions and billions of dollars to spare. We're just going to bring, you know, 1.9 gigawatts of clean energy and a few hundred megawatts of batteries, where the Saline Township one is just a bunch of 4-hour batteries. So, yeah. And then, yeah, just mentioning Illinois again. This is a bill that's being argued in the legislature, so there's always a chance of it passing. There's always a chance of it not passing. Um, oh, I apologize for the pronunciation. Um, and we are Volt Solar specifically is making sure, you know, that's the bare minimum of making sure that clean energy does come online at the cost of these huge technology companies.
I would also throw out that at least in theory, in state law, there is already a requirement in Michigan that these data centers get 90% clean energy. I imagine it's borderline just not enforced right now, but it relatively easily could be. And at least statutorily, one of the mechanisms is just requiring these data centers to pay a slightly higher rate and having that rate tied to statutorily required investments by the utilities in clean energy. There's, historically been some issues with that, but, in practice, if you just make them pay more and then have the utilities build clean energy somewhere else, you're still bringing on new clean energy capacity, and you're getting around that restriction that you can't literally fit it on the site of a data center.
Oh. Well, thank you. And along with, of course, the increase in CO2 would affect our environment if they're not bringing along clean energy. You've already discussed also the water protection bills. In addition to those two, are there any other environmental concerns you have with these data centers being built? Is there any contamination of the soil, et cetera?
I would throw out air pollution as one really big one that kind of goes under the radar. So across the board, data centers, especially commercial data centers, really don't like going offline for any reason. And especially somewhere like Michigan, I mean, we all know we don't always have the most reliable utility power supply. So generally speaking, you can get around that with storage, with large batteries on site, or you can get around that with a backup generator. And almost across the board, the cheapest way that data centers have gotten around any sort of reliability issues is with diesel backup generators that are on site. That's not a Michigan specific problem. That's across the board. And when these kick online, which can be quite often, you're talking diesel generators the size of a truck. Often, many of them, I believe Celine, they proposed like 12 of them. That has a measurable impact on air quality, especially if it's somewhere near a residential area. So if you have one of these right next to houses, if you have these gigantic diesel generators kicking on, even occasionally, but especially if they're kicking on frequently, that causes a very local, measurable, really significant air quality impact. And what we've seen somewhere like Memphis, for example, or rather right across from Memphis in Mississippi, uh, the XAI data center, there's a lot of these diesel generators that kick on a lot more often than they're supposed to, even under current EPA regulations. And that's causing just measurable, really bad air quality impacts in a more diverse, blacker part of Memphis that is already dealing with a lot of other environmental justice issues. So you can end up feeding into those existing air quality issues really quickly if you don't have some sort of protection, either limiting or ideally just banning the use of specifically diesel backup generators in these facilities.
And I would just say, Prescott, you really talked a little bit about some of the noise and other impacts that might be a little bit more continuous associated with that construction. I saw a lot of questions in the chat around the water pieces, and it's just something we couldn't cover with expert pieces now tonight. I'll throw in some reports from Alliance for Great Lakes that has done some really great work. I'll throw that into the chat, and I think it's a kind of a big unknown. Even with all the concerns around energy, we know a lot more about the energy piece. There's been, I think, a larger lack of transparency around the water uses, and even where it's going and where it's coming from, that we're just really learning about what potential other impacts there might be there now. But I'll put the Alliance for Great Lakes in the chat so folks can look at that. Oh, Amanda's already on it. See how fast they are? What else do we got? Who's up? Vicky, Amanda, what other questions can we come up with?
Let's turn over to Amanda now.
Yeah, and so many good questions. So I think I want to start with, we had a question about whether we're considering the energy consumption of manufacturing the data centers, complexes and servers as part of the local energy consumption picture.
I have not heard that. I think the again to my point that the focus of zoning, the focus really of everything when some community is weighing whether to do this or not, they're all looking at the permanent use. In the case of energy consumption, the energy consumption is massive on the back end. It's worse than anything you could have during the construction schedule. So yeah, I think the short answer to that is no. It probably is okay because for energy, you really should be focusing on how much they're going to consume over the long run in production.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that. And then we had a question about contrasting and comparing hyperscale data centers like the ones we've talked about in Saline and Lyon Township and other places with smaller deep green data centers being proposed like the one in Lansing?
So I don't have the specifics on what's been done in Lansing. I have some information on a second data center that's been proposed here in Beaver Dam, which is a far smaller facility. I was actually kind of surprised that anybody was proposing a smaller facility. I thought those had gone out of style. But maybe they're coming back like bell bottoms.
I think Lee might have some insight into this, maybe.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been following that, the data center proposed in Lansing. The biggest difference is that it's what's called a tenant data center. So Deep Green will own the building and the processors, but other companies will rent space within that data center. So it's not an AI training data center like the Saline Township, the proposed Saline Township data center. It is significantly smaller. It's not much different than I think 24 megawatts is the size, so it's not much different than data centers that already exist in places like Virginia and Texas. It's large. I think it's larger than anything currently in Michigan. But and the other unique thing about Deep Green's proposal is that they are going to use fuel cells for the power, and the waste heat from the fuel cells and from the data centers is going to go into the district heating system in Lansing. This is one that there's a lot of T's to be crossed and I's to be dotted to make sure that this does not have negative impacts on the residents of Lansing. But I would say that directionally, that's the type of data center that is most likely to have limited impacts on the community because of how it's being planned and proposed. But a huge caveat, and I see Prescott wanting to jump in here. There's a whole bunch of other questions to tackle.
I need, maybe this will help, maybe not. So when somebody says AI data center, well, they're talking about the proposed initial use of it. And that means they're going to put a special chip called GPU chips in it, and they generate more heat, they use more power. There is nothing stopping the tech company at the next refresh from using good old-fashioned CPUs instead of GPUs. AI is a use of a data center. General computing is a use of a data center. The data center itself is a shell with lots of power and racks and places for storage and CPUs. So the point of that story is what they're using it for at first might be different than what they're using it for 5 years from now. And similarly, there's a difference on day one if your user of it is a primary user like Meta or Google, and a rent a data center guy like QTS or Vantage. But that too can change over time. You could very easily, and I think this will happen sooner than later, you could have Meta say, gee, we built too many data centers. We don't need as many. I'm going to hold these 2 or 3 for sale. And then the next thing you know, your primary user of a data center in your town is now a rental data center company, and you're dealing with an altogether different partner and an altogether different valuation model, and things can go wrong. So again, when you're trying to weigh the risks over the long haul, keep in mind that just because it's proposed as something today by a company today doesn't mean that the use and the company aren't going to change really fast.
I just can't help myself. I'm going to comment that I don't think the zoning is keeping up with the technology.
You are correct.
Neither are the PSC regulations.
The tech companies are running way too fast, and that's their MO. That's what the industry does, and they will always outpace you.
Yeah.
And yes, it's a huge problem, and they're going to continue to take advantage of it because they know if they hurry, they'll get what they want, and they can ask for forgiveness later.
Yeah, that's why we're trying moratoriums. But okay, on with the next question. Any other?
Yeah, if we think we have time, I think of one more. And Sandra, to your point, I just threw a study about the data center about 3 miles from my home regarding the zoning not keeping up with the situation. So you're right on track there. And so we had a question about the tax incentives that we have in the state and if that significantly reduces the tax benefit to communities. And so I think Chris and Baratha might be best to answer that one.
I can speak to how it's worked in the past, which is that it definitely can. Like it shouldn't, but it definitely can. So one example of that, there's the data center that already exists is the Swift data center in Grand Rapids. It's in the an old sort of pyramid shaped building that used to be a furniture design center. And that actually got a previous round of tax exemptions, sort of just for that data center back in, I believe, 2016. I might have the year wrong on that. But at the time, the pitch was give us a sales and use tax exemption, and we'll pay a ton in local property taxes. They then turned around and were able to get what's called a Renaissance zone exception, as well as, I believe, a brownfield exemption, and just a bunch of the overlapping kinds of property tax exemptions that we have on the books in Michigan, each time requiring local approval, but essentially saying, hey, we promise that we're going to build this huge thing. If you don't give us this next little incremental property tax break, it's not happening. And in the end, even a city, that large in a not necessarily super desperate area for investment, they were able to get significant tax exemptions. So able to not only get out of paying that sales and use tax, but also a large chunk of the property taxes. They're still paying something, but you're able to cut down a lot of that revenue that at the end of the day is the reason for all this, right? Like that property tax revenue is the benefit that nominally justifies all these other costs in a world where the local community isn't directly getting much out of a data center. And if you don't have really strong protections at both the local and state level against getting those property tax exemptions, even in a world where that has to be approved at the local level, I think a lot of the issues that Prescott mentioned with just how big these are relative to a city's budget, that can make it very hard to say no, even when you know that you're giving away one of the only benefits you would get.
Baratha, did you want to address that? See what other states are doing there?
Not much to add, specifically regarding these huge AI data centers that are being built across the region, other than, yes, it's a hope and see situation, which, of course, when we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, hoping versus actually putting down state laws around tax benefits is, you should choose one over the other.
Well, I hope that everyone has learned a lot tonight. I know I did. Let's give these amazing panelists another round of applause in the chat. Show them some love with your reactions and get in there. And again, we could not cover everything tonight, as amazing as this was. Please keep the conversation going. Join us in my community online with us through MyCant. It is a registered space so that you can talk to each other about what's going on. And Sandy, League of Women Voters, thank you so much for co-hosting.
Yeah.
Did you want to close us out with any other remarks?
Well, yes, thank you. It's been great to work with Denise and Amanda and the whole MyCan team. Excellent job on this presentation. Thanks to our panelists, Chris and Boratha and Prescott and Lee. Great presentations. I have so many questions myself. And somebody else has started screen sharing. So anyway, thank you very much. We will post the video on our lwvmi.org/environment page. And thanks to Vicky for helping out with questions and Amanda. And that's all I have to say. Have a great evening.
Thanks so much again, panelists, attendees, for spending some time with us. Everybody have a great evening. Appreciate your time.